Dr. Allida Black.
I hate this part.
I'll make it short. Okay. A historian and founding editor of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers, which is a project designed to preserve, teach, and apply Eleanor Roosevelt's writings and discussions of human rights and democratic politics. Did I do that well?
Well.
Okay, good. She is here for an interview with Greg Peterson this evening. So Greg, if you would come forward.
Oh, I dread this. Look at this face. I mean, he's just gonna.
You have no idea what we had to do last time. For you folks here last year, she was unable to join us through some quirks of weather. Not that we've ever experienced it here whatsoever. So we had to do it via Skype, which was terrific. Not quite the same as having her here in the flesh. This is fantastic. And I bring greetings, by the way, from Drew Biter and Joe Carb.
Oh, Lord, my brother's by a different mother.
Yes. Yeah, and Drew, in his typical way, he is talking about the Holy Trinity in his world of Allida Black, Greg Peterson, and Paul Benson, and I don't get that at all. But that was his email just minutes ago, and so he asked if the first question could be. This is Drew. He asked if the first question, if you could give me the best Paul Benson story you have.
And I got to say it on camera?
Yeah.
Yes. When we did our first Teaching American History grant here, a gazillion years ago. Paul, when was it? 04? 03, okay. And then I came back in 04. And I said to everybody that I was going to Liberia. And so the next year they came back and they said, oh, did you go to Liberia? Did you go to Liberia? And I said, yeah, you want to see my pictures? They're on my laptop. And so I showed them my pictures. And Hunter, who was then in junior high, Paul's son, decided that he was going to use his internet radio show to raise money to build a school in Liberia because all the schools had been destroyed by a 17-year civil war. So we went from Hunter to Cassidy going to her high school, to Paul talking to people in the high school, and the K through 12 school in East Chautauqua Lake, right, Paul? Chautauqua Lake, okay. So what happened with that? The entire school, all the faculty, all the parents raised money to build a school in a community outside of Monrovia, Liberia, that had not had a school in 20 years. And in the biggest snowstorm of the year, tell me if I have this right, was it the police and the firefighters that were coming? The basketball game, do you remember? It was public safety people, and they were going to have a basketball game against the teachers in the school, and parents had made all these baskets, of food and fun things, and all of the money went to the kids' fund. We came out of that with enough money that the kids drove themselves. I mean, it was their idea. And they rebuilt a school for former child soldiers in Liberia. And it all started because of Paul Benson.
I don't think this is what Drew had in mind.
I know. So I'm really going to hear about it when he shows up tomorrow.
Gosh, you'll see this. So Liberia, which of course, Blood Diamonds and the whole Charles Taylor story. When you were there in Liberia, was that part of your conversation?
Well, I was there to campaign with and assist the woman who became the first democratically elected woman to lead an African nation, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who ultimately will win the Nobel Peace Prize. And she and the women of Liberia are the ones who stopped the war. Unless you think I engage in traditional Allida hyperbole, there's a very good documentary on this called Pray the Devil Back to Hell that my friend Abby Disney did. And basically, women decided that they were no longer going to abide by the war, and they dressed in white. And they put their lives on the line every day, sitting in the middle of a dangerous road where all of the butchers went by and dared them to kill them. And then when we finally got Taylor in negotiation, they went to Nigeria and circled the building where the negotiation was in because it wasn't getting solved. And Ellen was inside the building as part of the negotiation team. And so it was the women inside and outside the building that stopped the war and kicked Taylor out of the country.
We're going to go down this slippery slope for a little bit, so stay with me on this, because it's going to tie into the Robert Jackson Center. Because Liberia, Charles Taylor, and what happened in Sierra Leone, the United Nations created an ad hoc tribunal, and the first chief prosecutor, the founding chief prosecutor of that tribunal was a gentleman by the name of David Crane.
Yes.
David Crane was our past chairman of the Robert Jackson
And
Center.
it's at Syracuse Law School, right?
Syracuse Law School. And David and I toured quite a bit recently with his book that he's got on the subject. And I just talk a little bit about, gosh, this is so Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt, Declaration of Human Rights, that which happened in Liberia, the Charles Taylor. What was your sense of that? Because on this movie, shortly thereafter, David Crane unsealed the indictment and they actually arrested. There was a warrant for arrest of Taylor.
And let me just tell you, the warrant would have been nothing if Ellen didn't accept Taylor back into Liberia.
Correct.
Because Taylor had to fly back into Roberts Air Force Field in Monrovia. Ellen had to greet him at the plane and have him turned over. Now, I want you to know that that is the bravest act I have ever seen in my life, including a gazillion war zones, people that I know who have been, I don't know the verb, haunted, fractured, disparaged, spat on by torture. She risked everything in the future of West Africa, in a country that was still the most violent place in the world, more violent than Iraq, more violent than Syria, more violent than Afghanistan. And this woman, who is the size of my little finger, and was maybe, I'm guessing, 70 at that point, had this man brought home when part of his army was democratically elected to serve in the legislature, and send him to The Hague to stand for war crimes trials. And if that hadn't have happened, I firmly believe that international law would not have the precedence that it needs now to really be enforced, to have the weight.
Wow. Just a little bit of serendipity for us friends of the Robert Jackson Center at that welcoming committee, because she had to literally come back to the country, and then with that, given to the international war crimes folks. And the person who was there to greet her on behalf of that was James Johnson. Jim Johnson was our past chairman here at the Robert Jackson Center, for those who know that connect. And if Jim were here, he'd jump out of the seat saying, "Let me tell you more what happened." So this is remarkable. Yes, what she did. And just a little backdrop, when he was given the arrest warrant, he left. He left Liberia and went to...
Boom.
He went to, was it Nigeria, I believe?
No, he came from Nigeria, and he went to The Hague, right? He went to
No, absolutely. When he left Liberia, because he left.
He went to Nigeria.
Nigeria, and then they had to work out things. It's a long, crazy story. but then he had to come back, which was that part, and then got arrested and tried. And just tried, convicted, and sentenced not that long ago. Did you follow that trial? Did you?
Every day,
Yeah.
every day.
Are you in still contact with President Johnson?
Yeah. I'm on the board of her foundation. She is building I should say that President Sirleaf left office last year after 2 terms. She served 12 years. She was the first elected official in 76 years to orchestrate a peaceful transition of power. And so she is now setting up the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Presidential Center for Women in Development, and I had the absolute utter joy to be on her board.
We got to talk after this is over. We'll never get to Eleanor Roosevelt, but let's segue.
Oh, I can relate Ellen to Eleanor in a nanosecond.
Get me there.
Okay.
Get me back to Eleanor.
Okay. Well, the reason my whole connection to Liberia started with Eleanor, because J. Edgar Hoover, who was then director of the FBI, hated her. I mean, thought that she was a communist, that she really had colored blood, because those are his words in a memo, because she spoke out so much for the people, the coloreds, that surely she must be passing, and therefore she was a communist. And he wanted her stripped of her citizenship, declared a traitor, and sent to live with her people in Liberia. And so I was doing a workshop, sort of like this, but more like the conversation that, Brandon and Olivia in the brain trust that was, at my table we were having about Harry, we were having about democracy and the Roosevelts. And so I told this story about that, and one of the women who was there was from Liberia, and her name was Krubo Kali, and we became devoted friends. Her picture's in every room in my house. And Krubo taught me Liberia and introduced me to Ellen, and it all came from Eleanor.
Eleanor said that Franklin's death ended a period in history, and now in its wake, for lots of us who lived in his shadow, periods come, and we have to start again under our own momentum and wonder what we can achieve. Was that a clarion call to her? Did she feel like the shackles had been unleashed when Franklin had died?
No, I mean, they were not, they loved each other, but they were not, their relationship had changed. And what she felt tremendously was the burden of the war, how we dealt with fascism, how we would deal with our superficial understanding of democracy. And she would say to anyone that would listen during the Great Depression and during the Second World War that the lesson of World War I is that we had won the war, but we had lost the peace. And so she was determined in her own way to help build the peace, especially after she went to the Pacific in 1943. And she wrote a daily newspaper column called My Day, which is one of the 3 most syndicated columns in the United States. And she very much wanted to give recognition to the men and women who were, fighting and nursing and giving urgent care in the Pacific, the way the great columnist Ernie Pyle was doing to their colleagues on the Atlantic front. And FDR never would let her go. Well, there was a race riot in Detroit in 1943. She was blamed for the race riot, and the vice president, Henry Wallace, writes in his diary, Mrs. R gets to go to the Pacific because the Negro situation is too hot. And so Eleanor spends 5 weeks going to 17 tiny islands in the Pacific. She flies in unpressurized aircraft. One of her eardrums shatters. She'll be deaf in that ear for the rest of her life. The first day she's there, first 2 days she's there, she walks 50 miles, 50 miles of hospital corridors, and really just, there's no other word for it, screws up her arches, so she has to wear special shoes. And she begins to carry a prayer in her wallet that is, "Dear Lord, lest I continue in my complacent ways, help me to remember that somewhere someone died for me today. And if there be war, help me to remember to ask and to answer, am I worth dying for?" And she writes her great friend Truda Lash, saying, "The war fills me with the greatest sense of responsibility that I dread that I will never be able to discharge." And so she's very involved in the early days of the conceptualization of the UN. We know that she and FDR talked about the UN together. We know that people who wanted to end trusteeships, would go to her and use her as the conduit to get to FDR. And so when FDR dies, she's got to figure out what she can do in her own right, and in the same time, do it in a way that will fulfill FDR's legacy without doing disservice to him, because they had significant disagreements on what action should be taken. That was a long-winded answer, but it's honest,
And during World War II, President Roosevelt, I think it was during the State of the Union, talked about the 4 freedoms. Mm-hmm. And I assume this is kind of what she did at the United Nations, was sort of a direct descendant of that.
Yeah. Well, the 4 freedoms, freedom of speech, cardinal rule, always turn your cell phone off. Sorry, that was really bad. I realized that was going to happen, but I thought, how can I be discreet and take my cell phone out of my back pocket? Sorry.
It said Alan Johnson. It said
Actually, it was a human rights lawyer who was calling me, so it's pretty kind of interesting. But I should just say, Michael, you want to answer this question? I'm sorry, I got
no, 4 freedoms.
4 freedoms,
Yeah.
okay. Freedom of speech, freedom of information and worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And this is the first time in American history that you have freedom defined as both freedom from oppression, right? And freedom to do things. It's like finally we get Jefferson and Lincoln in the same place. And Eleanor had been a huge proponent of this, and the concept of the 4 freedoms is one of the building blocks of the United Nations, and certainly one of the building blocks of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the issue becomes, what does that mean? We're going to talk about this tomorrow when we talk about Harry Potter, because Harry Potter is the battle for the 4 freedoms, period, end of story. I mean, if you know the story of the battle to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's all through Harry Potter, all through. You can make Dumbledore, Eleanor, you can make Hermione, Hansameda. I mean, there are all kinds of things that work here. And basically what it is what do you need to have to build a community that will withstand the inevitable fear and turning against each other that happens in any community? How can you balance hope and fear? How can you balance joy and doubt concurrently? And Eleanor understood that. I mean, there's this young child who was from Kentucky, young African-American boy, 6 or 7, 1st or 2nd grade. As long as I've tried to track him down, I just know it was 1st or 2nd grade. And the reason I know this is, how when you're first starting to write and you hold that pencil like it's as tight as you can possibly be, and you write it on the paper, and it, it almost pushes through the paper. He's trying to sign his class photo to her, and you can just see him try so hard. And he writes her this letter about basically getting the pulp beat out of him at school. When he tries to go to a water fountain that doesn't have a sign on it. And she writes him back this personal, confidential, not for publication letter that says, basically, my heart breaks for you. School should be a safe place. And I know from my own childhood how horrible fear can be. But I want you to know one thing and promise me that you will remember this. And that is, courage is more exhilarating than fear. And in the long run, it is dangerous. All we have to have is the courage to look ourselves in the mirror and take one step at a time.
Yeah. The four freedoms ultimately find form in the United Nations Charter. And during this time period, there's an event which is at Nuremberg, which is the Nuremberg trial. And the chief American prosecutor is Robert H. Jackson. And for those who walked in, you saw a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt and Justice Jackson. Can you kind of draw a line from the Nuremberg trial and the atrocities that were evidenced there that Jackson prosecuted and to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights?
Absolutely. One of the things that Justice Jackson risks everything for is to try to conceptualize and have incorporated into law the concepts of crimes against humanity. I mean, we have a somewhat understanding of what war crimes are. But what we saw in World War II and the stigmatized and eviscerated populations that were not only tortured and exterminated, but after the war left in refugee camps. And I just want to give you, I'm going to come back to answer your question, but I want you all to have this image in your mind, okay? Europe is flipping out over 1 million refugees. We have lost our soul over a tenth of that in the border. There were 60 million displaced people at the end of the Second World War. 60 million people. And so you can think about crimes against humanity in the sense of let's putting these blood-sucking leech Nazis, and other war criminals on trial. But with crimes against humanity, the flip side of that is what? Love for humanity, right? Assistance, help to humanity. And so with Eleanor, it was both sides of the coin. It wasn't either or. It was how do we prevent war and how do we hold these people accountable who commit atrocious acts? And so while she was not in any way involved in the Nuremberg trials, we know that she followed the Nuremberg trials. We know that she followed the work to create the Convention Against Genocide. I mean, we have evidence in her own handwriting. We have newspaper columns, we have letters, we have articles that she's underlined, that she's clipped. So it's important, but it's not the basis. I don't want, to her, the Declaration does not come out of fear. The Declaration comes out of our obligation to one another and our obligations as citizens in a democratic little d world to figure out how to build a world that will mitigate war. And she would argue that if you had to have a vision to stand up to the horrors of the Holocaust. You know, go back to that letter of that little boy about the courage to look yourself in the mirror and take one step at a time. To Eleanor, it was fundamental, you know. Does the world suck, to be blunt? Are we defined by evil, indifference, and suspicion, and horror, and intemperance, and violence, and hatred? Or can we get out of that? And if we get out of that, how do we need to keep moving forward so we don't get lured back in? And to her, the Declaration was looking in the mirror. Greg, did that answer your question?
I think if you could help this audience, because they're smart people. UN General Assembly adopts in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Could you kind of generally describe what that was designed to do?
Well, General, okay. It was supposed to be, initially, a law, an international treaty. They wanted to do an international bill of human rights. But nobody could agree on what human rights meant. And nobody could agree, is this going to be international law or not? Because everybody was fighting over Justice Jackson's crimes against humanity. The flip side was, how do you help humanity? Do you just do political and civil rights? Or do you economic, social, and cultural rights? Remember, we're not all democracies here. And so what happens is they end up setting up a subcommittee of 18 nations. Now, I want you to think about this, y'all. And for the award winners, you know, it goes back to our fight at dinner. I mean, I deliberately baited you, so I'll just own up to it. I mean, I gave Brandon a really hard time, so I can pick on him tonight. But, you know, what I want you to think about 18 nations. And they don't agree on anything. They don't agree on God. They don't agree if God exists. They don't agree on government. They don't agree on citizenship. They don't agree on marriage. They don't agree on whether private property exists. They don't agree if children are little adults or children. I mean, there is no fundamental agreement. The only thing is by God, we beat the Germans and we deserve a seat at the table. And so the issue is, how do you take that, you know, that fury and that resentment and that, you know, and turn it into something? And so what the Declaration became was a way to do that, and it was pursued along 3 simultaneous tracks. The first is to give the vision. You know, what are human rights? And the clarion call for the Declaration, Article 1, was the hardest to negotiate. And that was, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights, and are endowed with reason and conscience, and should treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Okay, pop quiz. Who are all human beings? You're smart, tell me. Jeff, you don't count, you've heard this. How's that to say, Jeff, you can't count in a human rights lecture, right? Okay, but I mean, he's heard this. Olivia, who are people? Describe the people in this room. Look at your dad. Tell me about your dad.
His brown hair that has a bit of white in it. His wrinkle under his eyes and on his forehead.
Okay, you said, can I interrupt you just a second, darling? The first word you said nailed it. What did you say? And who's a he? And tell me about your mom.
She.
And who are you?
She.
And how old are you?
11.
And every person in the world, in every race, in every country. It is the first time in the history of the world, that there is a document that is agreed on by nations that say men, women, and children are inherently equal because they are endowed with reason and a conscience. Just to show you how difficult that was, took 3,000 hours of negotiations to come up with that one sentence. 3,000 hours. And so the issue is, compare that to the Holocaust. Compare that to all the stars and the badges and the despicable uniforms that you saw and all the names that you hear. And so what the Declaration was like the Declaration of Independence, Magna Carta, you know, the I Ching, the Talmud. It was a vision of what the world could be. So that's one thing. Then, simultaneously, they were trying to figure out how to define what those rights were. And they tried very hard to have this visionary statement, this call to arms, the Declaration, at the same time that they were developing legal covenants, which is like international law or treaty. And so you have a covenant on civil and political rights, and you have a covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, which I might add were only adopted 17 years after the Declaration. It didn't take any time at all to negotiate them whatsoever, okay? And then there's the third part that we're still fighting over, which is how do you enforce these? Is there an international human rights court? And so Eleanor Roosevelt makes a fundamental decision in 1947 as chair of the commission. And that is they were going to do a two-pronged strategy of trying to negotiate the covenants and the Declaration at the same time. And while she very much wants the Declaration to have the standing of law, she's very afraid, Truman is going to lose the election. And, you know, it's 1948. We have China, we have Stalin, we have, combustible colonial revolutions in Africa. She knows the window is very, very short. And she believes so passionately in this vision that she keeps people at the negotiating table till 2 and 3 in the morning. And just to make sure, when the Soviets decide that they're going to say this and then do that, and they keep replacing the delegates, so you have to start the negotiations all over. Think about this. She is an instructed delegate. She is supposed to obey the State Department. She is supposed to report to George Marshall, supposed to report to Truman. And what is she doing? She writes a newspaper column that names names and says how people aren't doing their jobs and how they're being obstructionist while she's a delegate to the United Nations. Can you imagine anybody doing that today? My God, they get fired like that, And so that column gets picked up and run all throughout Europe and all throughout Latin America, so that her pressure outside, her fierce negotiations inside, by December 10th, 1948, we get a document grounded in Article 1 that has 29 other articles that define what human rights are, both political rights and civil rights, economic, cultural, and social rights, the right to an education, the right to health care, the right to worship, the right to vote, the right to speak, the outlawing of torture. It's a remarkable achievement. It's just a tour de force in negotiation.
In fact, you manifested this in your exhibit that you curated, Eleanor Roosevelt's role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations. You were there. You were the person.
Well, I helped, yeah, but it was my exhibit, yeah.
Yeah. Take
Seems
credit.
kind of funny to say I did an exhibit for the UN.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah,
Yeah, so she was kind of a rebel with a cause.
yeah. Well, I mean, if you work on Eleanor and you work on Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and you know Secretary Clinton, and you don't act, you're not worthy to do the work. It's that simple. I mean, the last sentence Eleanor ever writes, and it's in Tomorrow Is Now, which she dictated when she had 103, 104 fever, bleeding from the back of the throat. She was too weak to hold a pencil, and she would lean over like this, and, dictate to the woman who was trying to transcribe her voice, that the woman, Eleanor Denniston, who was doing this work, was so worried about her that she would make up excuses to sort of cut the session short. And one night, the great labor leader, Walter Reuther, and his wife come to pay respects to her. They were very, very close, and they all know she's dying. And so they had dropped their daughter off at college, and they just came by to say, hey, and she gets up out of bed, and she goes down to talk to him, and she's so pumped. She just loved Walter Reuther, and she was so pumped, and she goes back into her bedroom, and she asked the young woman who was staying in her house if she would bring the manuscript. And in this, she writes in a very scrawly hand, staying aloof is not a solution. It is a cowardly evasion.
Eleanor Roosevelt, let me back up. We have a YouTube site here at the Robert Jackson Center, almost 10 million hits. But the hit we get the most is a segment we put up a few years ago on Marion Anderson. Marion Anderson, 1939, I believe.
Yeah.
And Eleanor Roosevelt was in the middle of working the politics, and she was a power broker.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying the obvious to a historian, but that really was a thing. And could you tell a little bit of that story? Because I will highly recommend to everybody who leaves here at some point, go on YouTube, find the Marion Anderson vignette, her speech and how that story. But the backstory is remarkable. Can you share that?
Well, Marion Anderson was an African-American opera star. Her voice, the great conductor Arturo Toscanini said, was the voice one hears once in a century. And she's born in Philadelphia, but was prevented, because she was black, from going to all the great opera schools. So she studied in Europe, financed by her mother, who on her hands and knees scrubbed department store floors, and by the people in her church. And so by 1939, she had won every award, international award, that you could win. She had performed before the King and Queen of England. She had won huge medals from Stalin. And for those of you that are Sound of Music freaks, in 1935, in the Salzburg Music Festival, site of Edelweiss in The Sound of Music, Marion Anderson wins that with Hitler in the audience. And when she opens her mouth, he gets up and walks out. And this is when, he's got his hands almost around the Austrian government. And so she comes to the United States, and she does a concert tour. And in 1939, she was scheduled to give a concert at the Rialto Theater in Washington, which was an African-American auditorium. Well, it's the Great Depression. The war's coming. It's bankrupt. It's closed. So there's no place comparable to hear the crowd that she would draw, both black and white, because she had a huge multiracial following. And so they go to Constitution Hall, which seats almost 4,000 people. It's in Washington, D.C. It's owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they get caught in a lie. You know, they say that they're booked for the day that she wants. And then they find out that there are days that are open, and so they go back and apply for those dates. And the DAR says that they have a standing policy of not renting the hall to Negroes. So the question becomes, where's she going to go? And people resign, but, you know, it doesn't draw any attention. And the NAACP goes to Eleanor and says, will you do this? And Eleanor says, they hate me. It's not going to do any good. These are the people that call the New Deal the Jew deal. You know, they're anti-immigrant. They're anti-Roosevelt. You know, me saying this is going to do nothing. Well, she thinks about it, and then she writes a newspaper column that is the most brilliant way to bring something to the attention of the nation without screaming. She says, I have debated an issue in my mind for quite some time now. And that is, if you belong to an organization in which you take no active part, should you remain a member or should you resign? She said, in the past, you know, I've stayed and tried to work, but in this case, I take no active part, therefore I'm resigning. She doesn't mention Marion Anderson. She doesn't mention the DAR. It's on the front page of 483 newspapers in the United States. And she takes the insult that was a local issue in D.C. and turns it into a national discussion about race. She says, why curse Hitler and suppress Marion Anderson? You know, why curse Mein Kampf and support Jim Crow? She lends her name and her support to this big citizens committee. You know, they go to a big white school in D.C. to say, you know, can we use your auditorium? You know, the school board's like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And they say, okay, well, you can do it, but you have to sign here that this will not serve as a precedent, and no African-American artist will ever come here again to ask for this. So they refuse to sign it. Eleanor invites Marion Anderson to the White House, brings her mother. You know, she performs for the president. You know, Eleanor and Marion Anderson and the president, the two guests, and, you know, Mrs. Anderson have coffee and tea together. The presidential limousine takes them back to Marion Anderson's hotel. Eleanor agrees to give Marion Anderson the Spingarn Medal, which is the NAACP's highest medal, on July 4th in Richmond, Virginia, capital of the Confederacy. I mean, you can't miss where she stands on this. And it's Ickes, though, who really deserves credit for the Lincoln Memorial. I mean,
Secretary of the Interior.
Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. And he goes to FDR and says, I think she should sing at the Lincoln Memorial. And FDR, quote, unquote, says, I don't care if she sings at the top of the Washington Monument as long as she sings. So what happens is that you get 75,000 people on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which is the largest gathering in the history of Washington, D.C. It's more people than greeted Charles Lindbergh, you know, when he flew solo in a transatlantic plane from the United States to Europe. And Eleanor, who had a radio program, goes to the heads of all the radio networks, and I strongly suspect, as in I would bet my mortgage, that what she says to the head of the 4 major radio networks at that time is, if you want me, you're going to broadcast this. So this becomes the first live, coast-to-coast, open-air music broadcast in the history of radio. And how the long-range effect of that is A, it turns Lincoln Memorial into a civil rights center, and two, in terms of policy, the people that formed the Marion Anderson Citizens Committee are the same people that will be known as the March on Washington Committee. As in 1963, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech, A. Philip Randolph. And they go to FDR and say, if you don't desegregate work in the defense industries, we're going to get 225,000 people in the streets of Washington. And FDR sends Eleanor and Fierro LaGuardia, the great mayor of New York, after whom the airport is named, to go negotiate with them. And Eleanor comes back to FDR and says, Franklin, listen, they got 75,000 people here for a concert. You don't think they can get 225,000 people here for jobs? And we get the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is the forerunner of the EEO. And Eleanor and Marion Anderson remain friends throughout their lives. And my favorite Marion Anderson story about this is they pass, and in this city, and they're both, she's singing and Eleanor's speaking in this auditorium. And literally, I mean, it's like Eleanor leaves the dressing room and Marion Anderson the next day comes in, and Marion Anderson writes in the mirror in the dressing room that in this room I followed greatness.
And both of them spent time at Chautauqua Institution, just for those at a little local connect. Eleanor Roosevelt, in your book, they said, continually asserted that civil liberties and civil rights were the cornerstones of American democracy. Before you elaborate, before I ask you to elaborate on that, what's the difference between civil liberties and civil rights?
Oh, Lord, I knew he was going to ask me this. I'm so not a lawyer. I would say, in Eleanor's mind, it would be freedom from and freedom to. Okay? Civil liberties are freedom from fear, freedom from confinement, freedom from prejudice, freedom from unjust incarcerations. Rights would be the right to have an education, the right to health care, the right to vote, the right to speech, the right to pray, and play. She would say that too.
Wow, that's a terrific definition.
So I'd pass the bar exam? Okay. My father would be shocked. Anyway, go ahead.
It'd be great. I know one of the things that I got to work it in right now, because Paul Benson, I don't want to see him drift. Because, he's at his advanced age, I've got to work these in early in the evening.
And plus, he's got my coat in the back of his car, so he can't leave yet.
He sent me last time.
Oh, I remember.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, okay. So we've talked about Eleanor Roosevelt, we talked to Marion Anderson, we've talked about all of the major political people, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Robert Jackson, of course. But most importantly, as far as Paul Benson is concerned, is your relationship with Elvis Presley's. And
I
Elvis
hate
Presley's
you, Paul
attorney.
Benson.
I didn't make this up. It's right here, folks. So if you could maybe, most of them remember Elvis Presley in some form or fashion.
I'm from Memphis. And my father was Elvis Presley's father's attorney. And I was the only girl on my block, when I was growing up. And my best friend across the street, Dad going across the street, was Alan Cartwright. And Alan had a grandmother we called Mama Cook. And Mama Cook would let us do anything, okay? And for Alan's birthday, we could go to Mama Cook's and ride go-karts. And man, that was the greatest thing, you know. You're 8, 9, 10, your parents aren't telling you to slow down. You know, Mama Cook was like way out of Memphis, next door to Graceland. You know, had this big driveway we could go around. Every single time we did that, Elvis would want to come over and shoot his guns. And we would have to get off the go-karts and get inside the house. And poor Alan Cartwright never had a birthday that Elvis didn't try to screw up one way or the other. So I'm not an Elvis fan.
So what was his reputation aside from that? I mean, you're in Memphis. He's sort of a
Well, I mean,
major league
everybody
player.
in Memphis loved him because he was profoundly generous. You know, he got a boatload of money to St. Jude's. He was famous for giving nurses pink Cadillacs and stuff. But, I mean, I never really, you know, spent time with him other than when he was making us get off the go-karts and go inside Mama Cook's house where we had to behave because she had nice things in her house and we couldn't, you know. But I did see him once when I came home from college, and at that point he was very much into addiction and had huge pancake makeup and you know, he'd sweat a lot and it would crack and it just kind of scary.
Put on a lot of weight.
Yeah, a bunch. Made me look skinny. That says a lot.
You are the foremost historian of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Wow.
Is that a heavy load to carry?
I'd say there are a lot of us who work on her. I think my friend Blanche Cook is just extraordinary. I work on Eleanor in politics. I work on Eleanor in the Declaration. It is, when I started, it was a very heavy load to carry. I mean, I remember when I wrote my, I was finishing my dissertation, and then I sent it in to be published by Columbia, as says the gleeful agnostic. I went to her grave, and I said, I really hope I got this right. Mm-hmm. You know, and then one of the park rangers, who's subsequently retired, took me upstairs to Valkill once I finished as like a thank, you know, like a job well done, girl, come on, you know, I'll show you. Because at this point they hadn't really preserved the floor, and, you know, the public couldn't go up there. And you walk up this staircase that's going to her second floor, and the staircase dead ends into this wall. And on it hung eye level in like a 79-cent Woolworths frame was the Herblock cartoon of an immigrant mother and her daughter on the bow of a boat sailing by the Statue of Liberty. And the mother is leaning down, you know, to say to the girl, you know, do you know who that is? And the daughter says, of course I know, it's Mrs. Roosevelt. And that's when I thought, okay, I'm not that off, you know. And then, you know, nobody will ever get anything right, but, you know, perfect. But I would be derelict. And, I mean, just cowardly if I didn't say what a profound influence Hillary Clinton has been in helping me understand that. You know, just seeing the struggles and the attacks and the persistence and the guard and the joy and the fierce patriotism and trying to figure out how to move things forward in a difficult time. So I am very grateful. The historians would kill me if they see this. I'm very grateful for my work on Eleanor, preparing me to help in my really sort of mediocre way Secretary Clinton, and I am profoundly grateful to Secretary Clinton for having the fortitude and love to make those values real.
Your
It's
book,
the honor of a lifetime, I have to tell you.
it's an honor for us to have you here. Her book, by the way, is Casting Her Own Shadow, the Eleanor Roosevelt and the Shaping of Post-War Liberalism, a terrific read. And you have cast a shadow here, and I'm going to make this pretty personal. We're going to end on this note. My daughter is here, my daughter Amy. I'm emotional. I don't do this. And so, as a result, Amy's here, and she has created something very special. I'm going to move here to read it, and then I'm going to have Amy here to talk to you for just a second, what she did in Detroit. So stay with me. Don't go away.
Yeah, come. Take the spotlight off of me, girlfriend. Oh, my pleasure.
So let me set the stage here. Rebel Nell began in 2013 with the mission to employ women facing barriers to employment in Detroit. We talked about Detroit race rights. Educate them on financial management, life wellness, and entrepreneurship, and empower them to transition to a life of independence. Rebel Nell is a fully sustained from the sales of its jewelry, meaning all of the proceeds go back to the women they employ in the form of livable wages, education, and support resources.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Fabulous.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Fabulous.
Support resources to ensure these women successfully transition to sustainable and independent lives. And Amy is the co-founder and the CEO of this organization, and recently was on the Harry Connick Show, Martha Stewart, and most recently in WGN earlier this week. So Amy, I know I'm going to give to you something that you'll give to her, but why don't you just talk to the Eleanor Roosevelt biographer?
I want to know about you.
Oh, no. I literally drove in from Detroit just to meet you, and so I apologize for being late, but we got a little bit of a late start, and Cleveland, turns out, is horrible to drive through. But yeah, so when we were coming up with this concept, I was living next door to a well-known shelter in Detroit, and talking with the residents there, especially in Detroit in 2013, to just give it some context. Detroit had just filed for the biggest bankruptcy in the history of our country. And so there were a lot of grassroots movements happening. At the time, I was working as an attorney. I'm giving you a very, very quick, abbreviated version of this story. But at the time, I was working as an attorney for the Detroit Tigers and love the city of Detroit. I've been very fortunate to have that be my home since 2007. But living next to the shelter and talking to these women really inspired me to find my way to give back to the city that gave me a shot at my dream. What did that look like? How could my friend at the time, now my business partner, how could we create a company that would teach a woman to fish? What does that look like? Not only could we provide employment, but then all the wraparound support. So this concept for this company started with a mission first, which isn't usual. I wouldn't recommend that for most business strategies. Start with a product. It's better that way. And so we needed a product to sell. Long story short, we actually make all of our jewelry from graffiti or street art once it falls off the walls. So kind of repurposing this street art. But each piece is truly one of a kind, not only because of the woman, because of the cross-section of graffiti, but because of the woman who made it. She gets to have a voice. So the biggest part was, how are we going to name this company? And so we deliberated for quite some time. We really felt it was important to pay tribute to a woman who was a trailblazer, whose ideas we could emulate. And over drinks, which all good things come from over drinks, we realized we shared a love of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, my God.
And we had both learned that her nickname, she was given by her dad, was Little Nell. We thought she was worthy of a more badass nickname, and that's how we got Rebel Nell. So,
Yay! Oh, this is so cool.
so our company is literally named after Eleanor Roosevelt. It's called Rebel Nell. We think that's fitting, A, because she's as everything you guys know and reiterated tonight, was incredible humanitarian, civil rights activist, women's rights advocate, and what she stood for at the time she was standing for, it's just mind-blowing and continues to inspire me every day. So thank you for doing all the work that we can learn and absorb, for everything that she did. And I think of it too as now she's our namesake, making sure we pay tribute through the work that we're doing at Rebel Nell. And the women we hire are incredible. They really want to rebel against what life has dealt to them. And we're making jewelry from a rebellious art form, such as graffiti, so it all kind of worked together. But we just hired our 22nd woman out of the shelter, so that was a really big milestone for us. So thank you. That's what I guess.
I cannot think of a single thing that would make her happier.
Oh, well, I appreciate that.
That is, oh my God. I'm
Actually, we have quotes of hers all over our workspace. You'd probably get a hoot.
I'm going to come.
You should.
I'm going to come. I'll give you my word.
I'm going to hold you to
coming.
that.
Okay.
Yes.
And I got more people you can go to. You should talk to Freedom House Detroit, too.
We hire from Freedom House.
Oh, you know Deb Drennan?
I don't know Deb personally.
Oh, sorry. It's like, I'd love Freedom House.
Yeah, so we've hired 2 women who are refugees from the Congo. So about 2 years ago, in response to the political climate, we expanded our hiring to just from women specifically in shelters to now it's women who are living in shelters, who are returning citizens, and refugees. So that's all-encompassing. But this is a gift for you, made by our team. So here you go, as to another Rebel Nell.
Oh, my God. Look at this bag. I mean, even the bag is good. Oh, my God. Oh, this is too beautiful.
Thanks.
Okay. You have to help me put it on.
Oh, I will. And we can do it
Okay.
after.
I'll take South Africa off, which I never do.
Put a little Detroit on.
Put a little Detroit on. Cool.
Ladies and gentlemen, Allida Black.
Oh, thank you all.